In the heart of Hong Kong, where towering public housing estates rise like concrete labyrinths, countless lives unfold in crowded corridors and echoing stairwells. These buildings are not just homes, they are places where whispers of the supernatural often linger. Stories born from tragedy and retold through generations. It is here that we meet Ming, a boy who spent his childhood running through these endless hallways, believing his world was safe and familiar. Yet among the neighbors he knew so well, there was one figure who stood apart, an old woman with a kind smile and a bag of candy. What followed would haunt him forever. Hong Kong in the 1990s was a city of contrasts. Bright lights flooded the crowded streets, markets buzzed with the sound of bargaining, and skyscrapers rose higher each year as the city transformed into a global hub. Yet, for many families, daily life unfolded not in the glittering skyline, but in the aging concrete towers of the city's public housing estates. These buildings, with their uniform corridors and stacked balconies, were worlds within themselves, self-contained communities where thousands of lives intertwined. Ming grew up in one of these estates. He remembered his childhood there with fondness, recalling afternoons that seemed endless and friendships that felt like family. The building wasn't just a collection of flats. To the children, it was a vast labyrinth, a playground where stairwells became hiding spots, rooftops turned into imaginary battlefields, and dimly lit corridors echoed with laughter long after school had ended. For Ming, those years were some of the happiest of his life. But within those same walls, stories circulated. Whispers about tragedies, suicides, accidents that had stained the estate's history. Children heard fragments of ghost stories from older siblings, while adults exchanged hushed conversations about neighbors who had died suddenly or apartments rumored to be cursed. In such densely packed quarters, life and death brushed up against each other daily, and the supernatural never felt far away. Among the many faces Ming saw growing up, one stood out most vividly, an old woman who lived on the 14th floor. She was frail, probably in her 80s, with thin white hair tied back and a kind smile that made her seem almost grandmotherly to every child in the building. She was always there, sitting on a small wooden stool just outside her door, watching the children as they played. In her lap, or by her side, was a simple red plastic bag, the kind you'd find at any market stall. Inside it, however, was what every child coveted most: candy. Whenever kids passed by, she would call out cheerfully, "Come here, children, I've got candy for you." And they would come running without hesitation. Stranger danger wasn't a phrase that occupied their minds. She felt too familiar, too much a part of the building itself. To them, she wasn't just a neighbor, she was a fixture of their daily lives, as much a part of the estate as the stairwell railings or the rusty mailboxes. None of them ever asked her name. None of them ever wondered why she always sat there alone, or why no family members ever seemed to visit her. She was simply the candy granny, and that was enough. For years, this pattern remained unchanged, until one night when something happened that Ming never forgot. It was close to 9 o'clock in the evening, and the sky outside had already turned completely black. The building was quieter than usual, as many of the children had already been called home for dinner. But Ming and a few of his friends had managed to squeeze in one last game of tag before bedtime. His footsteps echoed through the stairwell as he chased the others, his laughter bouncing against the concrete walls. He was it that night, determined to catch someone before the game ended. As he paused on the 13th floor, panting lightly, he happened to glance upward, and there she was, the granny. She stood on the 14th floor balcony, just one flight above, smiling down at him with the same gentle expression he knew so well. In one hand, she held that ever-familiar red plastic bag, bulging with candy. With her free hand, she waved at him, beckoning him to come up. Without a second thought, Ming began climbing the stairs. He never refused candy, especially not from her. But as he moved upward, something caught his eye, something that made him hesitate. Behind the old woman, inside her unlit apartment, two figures stood in the darkness. They were faint shapes, barely illuminated by the hallway light seeping in through the open door. Still, he could tell they were there, tall and motionless, watching. At the time, Ming was too young to dwell on it. His focus remained on the candy, and so he continued his way to the 14th floor. Yet when he arrived, the sight before him sent chills racing down his spine. The door was closed. The stool was empty. The old woman was gone. What stood in her place was something altogether stranger. Right in front of her unit, on the floor, a large white candle flickered gently inside a round metal basin. Its flame wavered in the still air, casting shadows against the wall. Hanging from the doorknob was the same red plastic bag he had seen moments earlier, full of candy. Ming frowned in confusion. How could she have disappeared so quickly? He had only taken less than a minute to climb the stairs. Did she go inside and shut the door that fast? It didn't make sense. Still, the candy was there, and childhood curiosity overpowered unease. He reached into the bag and grabbed a few pieces, shoving them into his pocket. But then he noticed something else. The front door, though it looked shut, wasn't fully closed. There was a small gap, just enough to peek through. For reasons he couldn't explain, he leaned in, pressing his eye against the crack to see if she was inside. The apartment beyond was abnormally dark, darker than any room he had ever seen, as if the shadows swallowed every trace of light. He squinted, trying to make out something, anything, and then he saw them. A pair of eyes stared back at him from the shadows. They were not the eyes of the kindly old woman. They were enormous, positioned so high that they nearly touched the ceiling, and they radiated a presence so heavy it made Ming feel small, powerless, like prey under the gaze of a predator. He staggered back, his heart hammering, as realization dawned that the darkness wasn't empty at all. Something massive, stood just inside, its towering body hidden, its face bent low to peer at him through the crack. Frozen in fear, Ming stammered, "Excuse me, is Granny home?" His voice shook, barely audible, no reply. The eyes remained fixed on him, unblinking. Just then, a voice rang out behind him. "Hey, what are you doing? Weren't you looking for us?" It was his friends calling from the 13th floor below. Relief surged through him as he turned back, but when he glanced at the door again, it had shut completely. Only the flickering white candle remained. That night, still shaken, Ming asked his mother if she had seen the candy granny lately. His mother froze, then said quietly, "Ming, you won't be seeing her anymore. She passed away recently." At first, he thought it was a mistake. He insisted he had just seen her that evening, but his mother scolded him gently, warning him not to speak of such things at night, or he would only frighten himself. As Ming grew older, he began to wonder about what he had really seen. The shadowy figures, the towering presence within human eyes, the white candle. Everything seemed to point towards something deeper than imagination. In Chinese folklore, there is a belief in two entities known as Oxhead and Horseface. They are the enforcers of the underworld, tasked with escorting souls into the afterlife. Described as hulking figures, one with the head of an ox and the other with the face of a horse, they are said to appear at the moment of death or shortly after. Terrifying as they may look, they are not considered evil, merely dutiful, performing their roles in guiding spirits away from the world of the living. Ming began to suspect that the figures he glimpsed in the granny's flat that night were not shadows at all, but these very escorts. Perhaps she had only just passed, and they had come to take her soul away. Maybe in her kindness, She wished to hand out candy to the children one last time before leaving forever. And the candle, its presence made sense once Ming learned the tradition. In Chinese culture, a single white candle placed outside a home signifies a death in the household. It is lit to guide the soul out, to help them find their way toward the afterlife, while also warning neighbors not to intrude. For days following a death, such candles may burn at the door as both a signal of mourning and a spiritual safeguard. The memory haunted Ming. Even years later, he could never shake the image of those eyes peering down at him from the darkness. Whether it was truly Oxhead or Horseface, or something else altogether, he would never know. But one thing remained clear. That night, the boundary between the living and the dead had thinned, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he had looked directly into the other side. In stories like these, there is always a moment where reality and superstition seem to blur, leaving behind questions that linger long after the tale has been told. The encounter with the old woman and her bag of candy is one of those moments that refuses to fade quietly. For Ming, the memory remained like a scar etched deep into his childhood, a memory that could never be dismissed as just imagination. He had seen her wave, had seen the bag of candy hanging from her frail hands, and yet, when he reached her door, only the candle and the strange figures were waiting. What truly unsettled him was not just the thought that she had already passed away, but the fact that the two ominous shapes in the shadows matched the description of entities spoken of in Chinese folklore for centuries: Oxhead and Horseface, the enforcers of the underworld. Their presence was not one of random haunting, but of order, duty, and inevitability. If they had been there that night, then there could be no mistake. The old woman had indeed departed, and what Ming witnessed was a glimpse into the thin veil between the living and the dead. The story raises questions that are not easily answered. Was the woman truly there, reaching out one last time to the children she had always adored? Did her spirit linger long enough to hand out candy one final evening, unwilling to break the routine that had brought her joy? Or was it something darker? A trick of the shadows? A child's mind conjuring shapes where none existed? To dismiss the event as coincidence is easy, but to do so would be to ignore the deeper layers of cultural tradition, where symbols carry meaning and every gesture hints at something greater than itself. The candle was not a random object. It was a funeral marker, a light meant to guide the departed soul and to warn the living to keep their distance. The figures behind her were not vague illusions. They matched precisely the guardians of the afterlife, ancient beings recognized by generations of believers. Even Ming's innocent desire for candy, so ordinary, so childlike, becomes unsettling when set against the backdrop of death. For who truly offers a child sweet comfort in the same moment that death itself is standing at the door? These questions hang in the air like incense smoke, curling upward, refusing to vanish. They force us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the world of the living and the world of the dead sometimes overlap, even in the most mundane settings, like a crowded apartment block. Perhaps the old woman's spirit simply wanted to keep playing her role in the community, even if just for one last night. Perhaps the children represented the joy she had in life, and in death, she could not help but try to leave them with something sweet, even as the underworld came calling. Yet, as with all tales of the supernatural, we are left without closure. The truth belongs to the shadows, and all we are given is the echo of a moment and the unsettling chill it leaves behind. That is the nature of ghost stories. They do not end with certainty, but with questions. Questions that remind us of the fragile boundary between what we see and what we fear might be true. But the night does not end with Hong Kong. Across the sea, another story rises from Taiwan. A story just as unsettling, though woven from different threads. Where Ming's tale was about a childhood memory colliding with ancient folklore, this next account drags us into the quiet despair of isolation, mental illness, and the stubborn presence of death within the walls of a family home. This second story belongs to a man named Mr. Yang, who chose a life different from the bustle of city apartments. Unlike the crowded housing blocks where Ming grew up, Mr. Yang sought peace in the countryside. He wanted space, silence, and the kind of solitude that the city could never provide. And he found it in a rural village where the air was fresh, the nights quiet, and the houses scattered far enough apart to give each family its privacy. At least that was what he believed at first. Directly across from his new home stood a 3-story house that belonged to a mother and her daughter. They were not close with the other villagers, but their presence was known, and their habits soon became familiar to Mr. Yang. The daughter lived on the 2nd floor, while the elderly mother stayed below. Their way of communicating was unusual, even old-fashioned, yelling back and forth through open windows, their voices carrying across the narrow street. Sometimes it was practical, just reminders about groceries or chores. Other times it was longer, conversations shouted into the evening air, as though neither of them cared who overheard. It was strange, yet strangely ordinary. And Mr. Yang soon grew accustomed to it, much as one grows used to the background hum of village life. Still, something about them always felt slightly unsettling. The mother never seemed to leave the house, and the daughter, though young, carried an air of disconnection. People whispered that she suffered from some mental affliction, though no one seemed to know the details. She avoided interaction with neighbors, kept her head down in silence, and when she did meet someone's gaze, it was with a coldness that unsettled even the most hardened farmers. There was no friendliness, no acknowledgement of shared humanity, just the vacant look of someone who seemed to see right through you. At first, Mr. Yang dismissed it as eccentricity, nothing more. But the longer he lived across from them, the heavier the atmosphere became. Their voices, especially the daughter's, echoed strangely at night. Sometimes she muttered to herself in words no one understood. Other times she shouted in bursts of rage, only to fall back into silence as quickly as she had erupted. There was no rhythm to it, no sense, and yet it carried the undeniable weight of grief and disorientation. And then one day, everything shifted. The old woman, who had been the silent presence within that house, was found dead. The authorities arrived, breaking down the door to discover her body. For the neighbors it was a shock, but for Mr. Yang, what made it truly terrifying was the timeline. Because just 2 days earlier, both he and his mother had still heard the familiar sounds of mother and daughter yelling to each other through the windows. 2 days earlier, he had heard the old woman's voice, loud, clear, alive. If she had been dead for a week, then who or what had been speaking from that house? This is where the story of Mr. Yang begins, and where we are forced to shift from one unsettling mystery in Hong Kong to another in Taiwan. The first story asked us to consider whether a beloved neighbor could linger beyond death, offering candy as a final gesture while escorted by the guardians of the underworld. The second story forces us to ask a different kind of question. When love binds too tightly, when grief and madness entwine, can even death itself be ignored? The transition between these two stories is not just about geography, but about theme. Both remind us that the living and the dead coexist more closely than we like to imagine. Both reveal how tradition, ritual, and belief try to make sense of what logic cannot explain. And both leave us with the same heavy silence, the kind that follows after you hear something impossible, yet cannot dismiss. So let us leave behind the echoing stairwells of Hong Kong's estates and turn instead to the quiet roads of a Taiwanese village, where another haunting was waiting. One that would unfold not in the form of candy or candles, but in the chilling words of a daughter who declared, "My mother doesn't eat hot food now anyways." When Mr. Yang first decided to leave the city, he thought he was making the best choice of his life. The endless noise of traffic, the suffocating walls of concrete, and the cramped apartments of Taipei had worn him down year after year. He craved silence, a slower pace, and perhaps the kind of stillness that would allow him to hear his own thoughts again. That was how he ended up renting a modest 2-story house on the rural outskirts, where the air smelled of damp earth and old wood, and the nights fell thick and quiet. The rent was surprisingly cheap, and for the space he was getting, it felt like a stroke of luck. He convinced himself this was the fresh start he needed. Across the narrow street stood another house, taller than his own, with 3 levels stacked unevenly like blocks pressed together. The exterior was plain, the paint faded, but the place was clearly occupied. It belonged to a mother and her adult daughter. At first glance, they seemed like any other neighbors. An elderly woman, fragile and hunched, living on the ground floor, and her daughter occupying the second. The 3rd floor was always dark, unused, as though it had been sealed away from time. The first oddity Mr. Yang noticed about them was the way they communicated. In most households, a mother might climb the stairs, or a daughter might come down to speak in person. Not here. Instead, the old woman would throw open her ground floor window, and in a hoarse but commanding voice, she would shout upwards. Her daughter, appearing in the window of the 2nd floor, would shout back down in the same blunt tone. Their words were sharp and carried easily through the quiet village street. Sometimes it was simple exchanges. "Have you eaten?" or "Bring the laundry down." Other times it was arguments, trivial or nonsensical, echoing back and forth until Mr. Yang closed his own windows to shut out the sound. It wasn't constant, but often enough to be unsettling. He couldn't help but overhear, especially at night when the air carried every sound. From his side of the road, lying in bed, he could almost imagine them standing at his own window, their voices bouncing against his walls. The daughter herself unsettled him even more. She was a woman in her 30s, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed both vacant and unblinking. She rarely left the house. When she did, it was usually to fetch groceries, her steps quick, her head low, her lips moving as though muttering some private conversation with herself. The villagers said she was unwell, suffering from some kind of psychological condition. They avoided her whenever possible, stepping aside on the road or pretending to be busy if she happened to pass. Mr. Yang tried to be polite the few times they crossed paths, but she never responded to greetings. She only stared, not hostile, but hollow, as if she were looking straight through him into something beyond. Life in the village was otherwise uneventful. Mr. Yang settled into his routines, longer commutes to work, quiet meals with his mother who lived with him, evenings spent listening to the cicadas outside his window. For weeks, the mother and daughter remained only background figures in his life. Their strange relationship, no more than a curiosity. Until one evening, everything shifted. He had just returned home from work when he noticed something unusual across the street. The front door of the mother and daughter's house had been chained shut from the outside, a thick metal loop fastened firmly through the handle. That morning, it had not been there. The sight stopped him cold. Why would anyone lock them in like that? A creeping unease settled in his stomach. He hurried into his own home and asked his mother if she knew what had happened. Her expression turned grave. "The old woman," she said quietly. "She passed away today." The news stunned him. Only yesterday he had heard her voice calling up to her daughter from the ground floor window, scolding her over something trivial. But now, according to his mother, officials had come earlier in the day, police and paramedics. They'd broken down the door, discovered the woman's body, and taken the daughter away for questioning. It was procedure, they said. Still, the reality sank in like a cold weight. The mother was gone. That night, Mr. Yang lay awake, his thoughts circling around the house across the street. He felt pity for the daughter, who now lived alone in that silent, cavernous building. Pity, but also dread. There was something in the way the voices had once echoed, in the way the daughter's eyes had lingered too long, that made his skin crawl. The following day, the metal chain on the neighbour's door was gone, and a faint light glowed once again from the second floor. The daughter had returned. Mr. Yang mentioned to his mother that they ought to prepare baijin, funeral gift money wrapped in white envelopes, to offer her as a gesture of respect. His mother agreed. It was the proper thing to do, but they would wait for the right moment. Best not to intrude during grief. That weekend, Mr. Yang got his chance. He saw the daughter leave her house, carrying a worn tote bag. By the time he reached the window, she was already halfway down the block, moving briskly toward the marketplace. He hesitated, but decided to follow. He needed groceries anyway, and perhaps this would be the right opportunity to hand over the envelope. Inside the grocery store, he spotted her in the checkout line. Her cart was piled with instant noodles and pre-packaged meals, the kind that required heating. The cashier rang them up without comment, but suddenly the daughter's voice cut sharply through the quiet store. "How do you expect me to eat this if there's no microwave here?" she demanded. The clerk blinked in confusion, explaining gently that this was a grocery store, not a convenience shop. There were no microwaves for public use. For a moment, her voice rose in anger, strange and disjointed, until just as suddenly, she stopped. Her expression shifted, her tone flattening into eerie calm. She gave a small shrug and said softly, "That's all right. My mother doesn't eat hot food now anyways." The words froze Mr. Yang where he stood. Every hair on his neck rose. His hand tightened around the envelope in his pocket, but he no longer felt capable of approaching her. His mouth went dry. The mother was dead. He knew that. Everyone knew that. And yet, here was her daughter, speaking of her as if she were still there, as if she were still sitting in that house across the street waiting for her dinner. Mr. Yang fled the store without saying a word. He bought what he needed and hurried back home. The image of her calm face burned into his mind. But when he returned, his unease turned into full dread. 2 police officers were already in his living room, speaking with his mother. They explained they were following up on the case across the street, asking questions about the neighbors. Did they ever hear arguing? Did they ever see anything unusual? Then, one of the officers, almost casually, revealed a detail that made Mr. Yang's blood run cold. The old woman, they said, had already been dead for 7 days when they found her body. 7 days. Mr. Yang and his mother exchanged horrified looks. It wasn't possible. Just 2 days before the discovery, they had both heard the mother and daughter shouting back and forth from their windows as always. Loud, clear, undeniable. If the old woman had been dead all along, then who or what had the daughter been speaking to? The officers, seeing the shock in their faces, grew tight-lipped. The rest of the details were confidential, still under investigation. They offered no answers, only thanked them for their time, and left. In the days that followed, the daughter vanished. A van arrived quietly one morning, and officials escorted her away. She wasn't arrested, but the villagers whispered that she had been taken to a facility, somewhere she could finally receive the care she so clearly needed. The house across the street stood dark once again, its windows like empty eyes, staring out onto the road. Mr. Yang and his mother never managed to give her the envelope of baijin. Instead, they decided to burn joss paper and incense outside the empty home, sending their offerings of respect into the smoke-filled sky. It was a gesture not only for the old woman's spirit, but perhaps also for the unsettled presence that seemed to linger in that place. Still, the questions never left him. If the mother had died a week before, how could their voices have carried across the street? Was the daughter so unwell that she had been yelling into silence, only for Mr. Yang and his mother to imagine a reply? Or had the mother's spirit, unwilling to leave her fragile daughter alone, stayed behind, still shouting from the ground floor window, still trying to care for her in death as she had in life? Even more disturbing was the daughter's quiet remark in the grocery store. "My mother doesn't eat hot food now anyways." It was said so simply, so naturally, as though she accepted her mother's death, yet also spoke as if the old woman continued to exist beside her. Mr. Yang could never decide which was more terrifying: the possibility that he and his mother had misheard everything, victims of their own imagination, or the possibility that the old woman had truly remained, her ghostly presence locked in that 3-story house, conversing with her daughter in the shadows of a world where the living and the dead were no longer separate. As the night draws to a close, we are left with 2 stories that refuse to settle neatly into the realm of logic. Was Ming truly visited by the spirit of the old woman, accompanied by the dreaded ox head and horse face? Or was it nothing more than the tricks of a child's imagination? And in that quiet Taiwanese village, did the grieving daughter unknowingly speak to her mother's lingering soul? Or was it her own fragile mind struggling to accept the truth of death? These questions remain unanswered, hanging in the air like whispers that refuse to fade. What do you believe? Were these simply coincidences wrapped in superstition, or glimpses into the hidden order of the afterlife? Share your thoughts, because in stories like these, the truth often hides between the lines of belief and fear. Thank you for journeying with me through tonight's chilling encounters. If you found yourself haunted by these tales, remember, this is only the beginning. More stories from the shadows of Asia are waiting to be told. Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and join me again next week for another descent into the unknown. Until then, keep your lights on and never ignore the whispers in the dark.